Turkic migration refers to the expansion of the Turkic tribes in Europe and the Middle East between the 6th and 11th centuries. The region of origin of the Turks is Central Asia, Xinjiang, Mongolia and Siberia. Certainly identified Turkic tribes were known by the 6th century, and by the 10th century most of Central Asia was settled by Turkic tribes. The Seljuq dynasty invaded Anatolia starting in the 11th century, ultimately resulting in permanent Turkic settlement there. Meanwhile, other Turkic tribes either ultimately formed independent nations, such as Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, or formed enclaves within other nations, such as Chuvashia. Turkic peoples also survived in their original range, such as the Uyghurs in China and the Sakha Republic of Siberia, as well as in other scattered places of the Far East and Central Asia. Ancestral populations. The earliest documented Turkic peoples appear as nomadic tribes on the plains of the Far East north of the Great Wall of China, which was constructed as a fortified border essentially between Han Dynasty China and the Xiongnu. Records of the Grand Historian. The population ancestral to the Turks is thought to have included the Xiongnu of Mongolia or along the upper Yenisei in Siberia. Known from historical sources, the Han Chronicle of the Xiongnu, included in the records of the Kurgan historian of the 2nd century BCE, traces a legendary history of them back 1,000 years before the Han to a legendary ancestor, Chunwei, a supposed descendant of the Chinese rulers of the Xia dynasty. Chunwei lived among the mountain barbarians Xian and Hunju. Xian and Hunju's names may connect them to the Turkic people, who later were said to have been iron workers and to have kept a national shrine in a mountain cave in Mongolia. Apparently the Xiongnu comprised a number of tribes and geographic groups, not all of which were probably Turkic. The records of the Kurgan historian mention the Mianchu, Hunrong and Yuan west of Long, the Yik, Dali, Weiji and Qian north of the Qianliang Mountains and Jing and Qi rivers, the forest barbarians in Lufan north of Jin and the eastern barbarians and mountain barbarians north of Yan. Later the treatise mentions others. There were apparently many of the latter. At the end of the Xia, about 1569 BCE, by the reckoning of the records of the Kurgan historian, the Chinese founded a city, Bin, among the Rong tribe of barbarians. In 1269 the Rong and the Dai forced the relocation of Bin. About 1169 BCE the Quanyashi tribe was attacked by the Zhou dynasty, which in 1159 forced all the barbarians into the submissive wastes north of the Jing and Luo rivers. In 969 BCE, King Mu attacked the Quan Rong and brought back with him 4 white wolves and 4 white deer. The early Turkic peoples believed that shamans could shape-shift into wolves. In 769 Marquis Shen of the Zhou enlisted the assistance of the Quan Rong in rebelling against the Emperor Yu. The barbarians did not then withdraw but took Zhaohuo between the Jing and Wei rivers and from the went marauding into central China, but were driven out. In 704 the mountain barbarians marauded through Yan, and in 660 BC attacked the Zhou Emperor Xiang in Luo. He had discarded a barbarian queen. The barbarians put another on the throne. They went on plundering until driven out in 656 BC. Subsequently the Chinese drove out the Dai and subordinated all the Xiongnu. Around 456 BC the Chinese took Dai from them. The Yik tribe tried building fortifications but lost them to the Chinese in this period of their expansion. Here the detail of the narrative increases as it deals with the rise of the Qin dynasty of 221–206 BCE, which is no doubt mainly historical rather than legendary. The Qin kept the Xiongnu at bay. Equestrian pastorals of the Northeast. The physical characteristics of populations of speakers of Turkic language stretch across a range as wide as the land they inhabit. The Turkic peoples in Europe look European, with the exception of some Crimean Tatars and Turkics in the Caucasus who look European plus Northeast Asian, while Turkics in the Middle East resemble the peoples of the Middle East. Those in Central Asia mostly look mixed but have mostly Northeast Asian features. Turkics in Northeast Asia resemble populations in that region. In trying to answer such questions as what race were the Proto-Turkic speakers, neither anthropometric nor genetic studies have been of much assistance to date. What few DNA analyses have been done arrive at the problem as an answer. Affinity to primarily Western populations in the West, East and in the East, and a mixture on a gradient from East to West or vice versa in between. These biological circumstances suggest that racial evolution over the region is earlier than can be considered in the time of the distribution of languages, i.e., the languages may have evolved among populations that were already mixed. Concerning the cultural genesis of the Huns, the Cambridge Ancient History of China asserts, beginning in about the 8th century BC, throughout Inner Asia horse-riding pastoral communities appeared, giving origin to warrior societies. These were part of a larger belt of equestrian pastoral peoples stretching from the Black Sea to Mongolia, unknown to the Greeks as the Scythians. The Scythians in the West were Iranian-speaking, one among very many languages ultimately descended from Proto-Indo-European, whose speakers themselves are also hypothesized to have occupied the Pontic-Caspian steppe. According to the leading theory of Indo-European origins, the Kurgan Model, the communities of the northern belt north of China are historically Inner Mongolia region where the Proto-Xiongnu were. Xiongnukin's campaign against the Xiongnu of 215 BCE kept the Xiongnu at bay, driving them out of and seizing the Ordos region. Problems re-emerged after the Qin dynasty. The Xiongnu attacked Shanxi of the Han in 201 BCE. Emperor Gaozu of Han bought them off with jade, silk and a Chinese wife for the Shani, or leader. Relations with the Xiongnu continued to be troubled, and in 133 BC Emperor Wu of Han proceeded against them with 300,000 men. 81 years and 14 expeditions later, in 52 BC, the southern Xiongnu surrendered and the northern desisted from raiding. The Han dynasty military expeditions continued near the frontier of China in the Han-Xiongnu War, and in 89 AD the Xiongnu state was defeated and soon ended. One especially severe round of nomadic rebellion in the early 4th century has led to the certain identification of the Xiongnu with the Huns. A letter written in the ancient Sogdian language excavated from a Han dynasty watchtower in 1911 identified the perpetrators of these events as the XWN Huns, supporting the Gein's 1758 identification. The equivalence was not without its critics, notably Otto J. Malyank and Helfen, who argued that XWN was a general name and could refer to anyone. More recently other evidence was noticed. Jafar, who a monk, translated Sanskrit Huna in the Tathagata Gurya Sutra and in the Lalita Vistara Sutra as Xiongnu. Vasia reconstructs the pronunciation as *Zwangnuo. Moreover, the Book of Wei states that the king of the Xiongnu killed the king of Sogdia and took the country. An event is datable to the time of the Huns, who did exactly that. In short, the name of the Huns is a precise referent and not generic. Huns. Identity of the Huns. While their actual identity is still debated, the Huns have often been considered a Turkic people, and sometimes associated with the Xiongnu. Orosius has the Huns riding down upon the Ostrogoths in the year AD 377 totally by surprise, long shut off by inaccessible mountains, and apparently of hitherto unsuspected existence. Whatever may have been his reasons for making such a statement, he and Goths might have found ample reference to the Huns in the classical geographers, such as Pliny and Ptolemy. In fact, some were already in Europe. The mountains were mythical as the Ostrogoths were located on the Pontic steppe, an easy target for Hunnic cavalry, while in Europe they incorporated others, such as Goths, Slavs, and Alans. The Huns were not literate and left nothing linguistic with which to identify them except the names, which derive from Germanic, Iranian, Turkic, unknown, and a mixture. Some, such as Altinkur and Alpilkur, are like Turkish names ending in kor, Pekanek names in zor, and Kyrgyz names in koro. Names ending in gur, such as Utagur and Onoga, and Jaya, such as Altingir, are like Turkish names of the same endings. The Huns called themselves the Akatir, which Wilhelm Tomacek derived from Agaciari, forest men, reminiscent of the forest barbarians of the Shiji. The Agag area mentioned in an AD 1245 Turco-Arabian dictionary. The name Agac area occurred in later history in Anatolia and Khuzestan. Malyankan Helfen rejects this etymology on the grounds that G is not K and there appears to be no linguistic rule to make the connection. Herodotus, however, mentions the Agathasi, whom Latham connects with some early Akatiri in Dacia. Jordanus places the most mighty race of the Akatziri, ignorant of agriculture, which lives upon its herds and upon hunting, south of the East. A number of sources identify the Bulgars with the Huns. Another branch were the Saviri, or Sabir people, the strongest candidate for a remnant of the speakers of the Hunnic language of the Chalvash, who are on or near the location of the Volga Bulgars, Gokturks. The end of the Huns as a Eurasian political unity is not known. A token endpoint for the Huns of the West, perhaps all the Huns, is the fixation of the head of Dengizich, of son of Attila, on a pole at Constantinople in 469. He had been defeated in Thrace in that year by Anagastes, a Gothic general in the service of the Roman Empire. Various peoples continued to call themselves Huns even though acting autonomously, such as the Sabir people. According to the Cambridge History of Early Inner Asia, the last state to call itself Hunnic was the Caucasian kingdom of the Huns, visited in 682 by an Albanian bishop. Many of these peoples were Turkic, but meanwhile other coalitions leading to explicitly named Turkic empires had been forming on the original range of the Xiongnu. Their expansion has been conventionally called the Turkic migration, but in fact the Turkics had already been migrating for some centuries. 5. The early 4th century saw a rebellion with sacking of northern Chinese cities by the Xiongnu. However, most of the Xiongnu were later wiped out by the Chinese Ranwei state after Ranmin's Kul order following the end of the Weiji War, which annihilated 3 of the 5 Hu tribes. In that century some of the Xiongnu broke away and joined with the Da as the 5 Hu, or 5 barbarian peoples, as the Chinese called them, for purposes of ruling the north of China. The 5 Hu were the Xiongnu, Ji, Chiang people and Abe. Although different groups of historians and historiographers have their own definitions. Roran and Tyler. However, the Chinese name Tyler, corresponding to Turk, was used much earlier, around the period when the Mongolic tribes Tuaba and Roran vied for hegemony over the Mongolian steppes around the 5th and 6th centuries. Tuju, The term Turkic, corresponding to the Chinese name Tuju, was first used as an endonym in the Orkhon inscriptions of the Turks of Central Asia. The first reference to Turks appears in Chinese sources of the 6th century. The earliest evidence of Turkic languages as a separate group comes from the Orkhon inscriptions of the early 8th century. The precise date of the initial expansion from the early homeland remains unknown. The first state known as Turk, giving its name to the many states and peoples afterwards, was that of the Turks in the 6th century. The head of the Ashina clan led his people from Legion to the Rauran, seeking inclusion in their confederacy and protection from China. His tribe comprised famed metalsmiths and was granted land near a mountain quarry that looked like a helmet, from which they got the name. A century later their power had increased such that they conquered the Rauran and set about establishing a Göktürk empire. The Turkic family of languages were spoken by Bulgars, Pechenegs, Cumans, Dingling, Gayaj peoples long before the Göktürk Khanate came into prominence. Many groups speaking Turkic languages never adopted the name Turk for their own identity. Among the peoples that came under Göktürk dominance and adopted its political culture and lingua franca, the name Turk wasn't always the preferred identity. In other words, there wasn't a unified movement westward by culture under one unified ethnic identity, such as that of the Mongol conquest of Eurasia under the Chingashid political leadership. Rather, Turkic languages, both peripheral ones like the Bulgar branch and central ones like the Oghuz and Karluk Chagatai branches, drifted westward by autonomous movements of diverse tribes and migrating traders, soldiers and townspeople, outnumbering and assimilating non-Turkic indigenous peoples along the way, and being partly replaced by other language families that have become prominent in the East, such as Mongolic languages on the Mongolian steppes, Indic languages in India, and Persian in post-Timurid Iran. Uyghurs. Later Turkic peoples include the Karluks, Uyghurs, Kyrgyz, Oghuz Turks, and Turkmens. As these peoples were founding states in the area between Mongolia and Transoxiana, they came into contact with Muslims, and most gradually adopted Islam. However, there were also some other groups of Turkic people who belonged to other religions, including Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and Zoroastrians. Turkmens, while the Kara Khanate state remained in this territory until its conquest by Genghis Khan. The Turkmen group of tribes was formed around the core of westward Oghuz. The name Turkmen originally simply meant "I am Turk" in the language of the diverse tribes living between the Kara Khanate and Samanid states. Thus, the ethnic consciousness among some, but not all Turkic tribes as Turkmens in the Islamic era came long after the fall of the non-Muslim Göktürk Khanates. The name Turk in the Islamic era became an identity that grouped Islamized Turkic tribes in contradistinction to Turkic tribes that were not Muslim, such as the Nestorian Naiman and Buddhist Tuvans. Thus the ethnonym Turk for the diverse Islamized Turkic tribes somehow served the same function as the name Tajik did for the diverse Iranian peoples who converted to Islam and adopted Persian as the lingua franca. Both names first and foremost labeled Muslimness, and to a lesser extent, common language and ethnic culture. Long after the departure of the Turkmens from Transoxania towards the Karakum and Caucasus, consciousness associated with the name Turk still remained, as Chagatai and Timurid period Central Asia was called Turkestan and the Chagatai language called Turkey, even though the people only referred to themselves as Mughals, Sart, Taranchis, and Tajik. Turks. This name, Turk, was not commonly used by most groups of the Kayfshik branch, such as the Kazakhs, although they are closely related to the Oghuz and Karluks. Neither did Bulgars and non-Muslim Turkic groups come close to adopting the ethnonym Turk in its Islamic-era sense. Among the Kara Khanate period Turkmen tribes rose the Atabeg Seljuq of the Kurgan tribe, whose dynasty grew into a great Islamic empire stretching from India to Anatolia. Turkic soldiers in the army of the Abbasid caliphs emerged as the de facto rulers of much of the Muslim Middle East from the 13th century. The Oghuz and other tribes captured and dominated various countries under the leadership of the Seljuq dynasty, and eventually captured the territories of the Abbasid dynasty and the Byzantine Empire. Meanwhile, the Kyrgyz and Uyghurs were struggling with one another and with the Chinese Empire. The Kyrgyz people ultimately settled in the region now referred to as Kyrgyzstan. The Batu hordes conquered the Volga Bulgars in what is today Tatarstan and Kipchaks in what is now southern Russia, following the westward sweep of the Mongols in the 13th century. Other Bulgars settled in Europe in the 7th–8th centuries, but were assimilated by the Slavs, giving the name to the Bulgarians and the Slavic Bulgarian language. It was under Seljuk suzerainty that numerous Turkmen tribes, especially those that came through the Caucasus via Azerbaijan, acquired fiefdoms in newly conquered areas of Anatolia, Iraq, and even the Levant. Thus, the ancestors of the founding stock of the modern Turkish nation were most closely related to the Oghuz Turkmen groups that settled in the Caucasus, and later became the Azerbaijani nation. By early modern times, the name Turkestan has several definitions. Land of sedentary Turkic-speaking townspeople that have been subjects of the Central Asian Chaghatiads, i.e., Sarts, Central Asian Moguls, Central Asian Timurids, Uyghurs of Chinese Turkestan, and the later invading Tatars that came to be known as Uzbeks. This area roughly coincides with Khorasan in the widest sense, plus Tarim Basin, which was known as Chinese Turkestan. It is ethnically diverse, and includes homelands of non-Turkic peoples like the Tajiks, Pashtuns, Hazaras, Dungans, Dzungars. Turkic peoples of the Kayfshik branch, i.e., Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, are not normally considered Turkestanis, but are also populous in many parts of Turkestan, a specific district governed by a 17th-century Kazakh Khan in modern-day Kazakhstan, which were more sedentary than other Kazakh areas, and were populated by towns-dwelling Sarts.